the most part, our hospices are very happy, lively, busy places, full of stuff to enchant children. Bright colours, a music studio, a sensory playroom, computers, dressing up codes, and most importantly, a huge sense of children being here or there to have fun. They come to us throughout their whole lives, not just at the end when they're dying, but regularly to come and stay for short breaks or respite care. And that's why it's so important, evenings like this, to keep on helping us do what we do and make a real difference to people's lives. So thank you everybody for coming along tonight. Thank you.
I will introduce you just a little bit to Anthony Horowitz. I'm sure you know really, but he's written dozens, literally dozens of books for both adults and youngsters. His Alex Rider series sold about 19 million copies across the world. You've seen his work on television, I'm absolutely sure, including Foyle's War, Midsummer Murders. He was awarded the OBE, but I don't think he likes to talk about that too much, in the New Year's Honours for his services to literature. And his most recent novel, I think most of you have probably bought it and got it signed today anyway, published at the end of last month, is Moriarty. Now, this follows his Sherlock Holmes and Watson story, The House of Silk, which he was commissioned to write by the Conan Doyle estate and Orion Books. So I want to know, were you so hooked into the world of Sherlock Holmes, which I think you've loved since a youngster, that you wanted to carry on, and that's why you wrote Moriarty?
Well, yes, I was hooked into the world of Sherlock Holmes. When I was 17 years old, my father gave me the complete works for a Christmas present, which is actually one of the reasons why I started writing murder mystery in the first place, because I so loved those stories. And what they really did for me, I was living in a very, very dull suburb in the north of London, a place called Stanmore, and I was always slightly bored as a child. And when I was reading the Sherlock Holmes stories, his stories have a temple in India with a buried treasure, or secret societies in America, and somehow the tendrils reach out from those places to even more boring suburbs like Norwood and Croydon. And I thought, if that's what can happen down there, maybe somewhere in Stanmore there's a Moriarty hiding and I can find it. So the stories had a huge impact on me as a kid. And when the Doyle estate came to ask me to write the House of Silk, which is my first foray into it, this is one of these, what are called, it's a dreadful thing, it's a continuation novels, is the common phrase for them. And what they basically are doing is, publishers are scared these days. I mean, it's very hard to have a, to have a hit book. It's a very tough market. So they come up with this idea that if you get a famous character, Poirot, Sherlock Holmes, James Bond, whoever, and then put a new good-selling writer on top of it, you will have an instant success. And that's, I'm slightly worried about sort of like cynicism of it. It is a sort of a marketing exercise, and I did have to think quite hard about whether to do it or not. And I suppose I must have thought for 5 or 6 seconds before I said, yes, I'm going to do it. And the reason I did it, and the only reason, was because I just so loved those books. And who could resist an invitation to move into 221B Baker Street and spend 3 to 6 months with 2 of the greatest characters and the greatest friends in British literature?
Huge challenge.
Well, people do say that it was a challenge, but actually, no, in a funny way, it was easier to write a Sherlock Holmes book than it was to write one of my own books. And the reason is, when I set out to write a book, I start with an empty piece of paper and a desk, and I have to create everything. But if you start with Sherlock Holmes, first of all, you have got the wonderful language of Conan Doyle. You've got the world that he created. And how many writers are there who have actually managed to sum up a world so completely and so succinctly? If I say to you, cobblestones, a growler, a hansom cab, gaslights, fog, a Stradivarius, where else can you be but London at the end of the 19th century? And so to slip into that world and to sort of put on the mantle of the best-selling, the perfectly tailored suit of Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, it made me raise my game. It actually was, in some respects, challenging, yes, I didn't want to muck it up, but in some respects easier than having to do the whole thing for myself.
Is it true that you write it with a fountain pen?
I do try. I write all my books with a fountain pen. I've always been a great lover of nibs and ink and paper. And the reason for this is that all the writers I most admire, and with whom I do not compare myself incidentally, friendly, but people like Charles Dickens and George Gissing and Trollope, they used fountain pens. And I like to think of ink as being the blood that flows through the arteries of writers across the centuries. And so by writing with a pen, I'm being like them. Also, why would I want to have Bill Gates between me and my paper? You know, it's a different experience.
So tell us how you came to Moriarty, because it's a much darker book, isn't it?
Well, Moriarty is quite dark, and it was quite hard to control the violence in it, because I didn't want to write a book that would be sort of upsetting. But it does look at a particularly nasty villain, Clarence Devereux, and it looks at the world of Moriarty and the world of criminals and the underworld of the 19th century. And the idea came about in this way. As I say, I'd done The House of Silk, and having succeeded with it, it seemed a waste of time, really. Or not a waste of time, but it seemed somehow a little bit feeble, a bit unadventurous, just to do the same thing again. Another untold mystery of Sherlock Holmes that nobody knows about, another reason why it wasn't told, another Watson investigation. So I wanted to revisit the world, but in a completely different way. And my first thought was, well, if I've done a Holmes, let's go to the other side of the coin and go for Moriarty. Moriarty appears in one Sherlock Holmes story. He's only in the one, the final problem. And he's mentioned in 2 or 3 others, but that's his only appearance. And yet he has this extraordinary grip on our consciousness, possibly because he's got such a wonderful name, but also because of just what Doyle invests in him, and because of the right and back falls and all that. So I thought, okay, fine, I will take on the mantle of Moriarty. And the second thought was, Moriarty is supposedly the most evil man on the planet. Is it possible to write an evil book? And for those of you who have got it tonight and who are about to read it, bear that in mind when you get to the end of it. That was my aim, was to write an evil book. I would write a book that would take you along quite cheerfully for 200 or so pages, and then on page 201 or wherever it is, I would do something so awful and so unexpected and so totally unreasonable that you would just simply throw the book away and never read anything by me again. That was sort of the idea. And that is what I got.
And how's it been going from a Conan Doyle as a Sherlock Holmes to a James Bond?
Well, James Bond is a lot more difficult than Sherlock Holmes for all sorts of reasons. First of all, Sherlock Holmes he's not a pinnacle. He's protected by the years. He's a 19th century creation, and we all sort of, thanks to the brilliant drawings of Sidney Paget, and thanks to Jeremy Brett, and indeed to Benedict Cumberbatch, we all sort of know who Sherlock Holmes is. With Bond, we're not so sure. I mean, is Bond Sean Connery, or is he, heaven help us, Roger Moore? Is he Daniel Craig, or is he even David Niven, who was the first choice by Ian Fleming to write for that character? And then, of course, if I write James Bond, am I writing for the audience that is familiar with Casino Royale, with the Bond films, or am I writing for people who read the books? Now, who does read the books, and do they realise how different the books are from the films? No gadgets, just one simple thing, that in the Bond films, Bond is always given gadgets by Desmond Llewellyn, who played Q, and then by John Cleese, who did the same part, one of the most disastrous pieces of casting in my view in cinema. But there you go. And but in the books, Bond doesn't have gadgets, so they aren't there. And then there's another problem. How do you marry if I want to do Bond, the real Bond, how do I marry his horrendous attitudes to life with what you, as a modern audience, want to read? So will you buy into a character who is homophobic, who sees women as objects simply to be possessed, who sees foreigners as being unpleasant and only there really to be killed, who has no warmth, has no goodness in him at all? How do I square that circle of being true to the original creation without putting everybody off in a modern audience? And that has been part of the fun of writing the book. That's been the main challenge of it.
New villains then?
Yeah, well, everybody has to be new. I mean, it all has to be made up. And creating a Bond villain is one of the hardest jobs these days because, you know, after Mike Myers and those ridiculous parodies of James Swan, if I have a character who sits there with a high collar and a cat on his knee, I'll just get laughed at. So it has to all be redone and rethought. I'm very pleased with the villain of the book. I think he or she is an interesting construct.
And the lovely thing for you as well, I imagine, is that you've been able to use some of Ian Fleming's original works to work on.
Yes, this was an interesting thing, that Fleming wrote a series of television treatments for a television series that was going to be made in America, but the films happened, and as a result of that, the television series didn't. And so he used some of these short stories in For Your Eyes Only and Octopussy, which he just simply took the stories and then elongated a bit, and he left 5, of which one concerns a plan to kill Sterling Moss of all people at a racetrack in Germany called the Nürburgring, The Nürburgring also named by Stirling Moss as the Green Hell. I'd have loved to have used that in the book, except unfortunately he said it in 1959, which is after my book takes place. But and I didn't use Stirling Moss either because, again, obeying the rules of Ian Fleming, Fleming didn't put real people into his books. He mentioned them occasionally, but they never turned up as main characters. Something also true of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes never met famous people. He only met constructs and dukes and duchesses and kings and queens that didn't exist. And it rather annoys me that there are so many Sherlock Holmes continuation novels where he has met Jack the Ripper, obviously, but also Tarzan in one book, and even there's a Sherlock Holmes book where he meets a young Adolf Hitler, which is sort of interesting. But I did none of that, and so again with Fleming, no real characters.
11-year-old Ben has asked me to say that he's worried that you might not write any more Alex Rider books, that he's heard that, and he's feeling very sad, and could you reconsider, please? Ben,
I've got bad news. I don't think I'm going to do any more Alex Rider. I haven't made, look, never say never, as one of the Bond films suggested. I've sort of moved on from writing children's books a little bit, largely because my sons are now 25 and 23, and therefore it's much harder to find a voice for young people. Also, between you and me, I have a concern that actually children's narrative fiction is in a slight rut at the moment. If you look at what's happening in the world of children's books, the two biggest sellers at the moment are the David Walliams books and the Wimpy Kids books. And I've got no particular problem with either of them. I think they're both quite fun and quite entertaining, but I also think they're quite useless. They're not actually, giving children a vision of life that is original, and they're not also giving them that sort of long-form fiction that I and Philip Pullman and Michael Morpurgo and Owen Colfer and Jacqueline Woods and all the other writers were doing, 10 years ago. And so I'm not so sure at the moment there is even a market for the sort of books I want to write. Not that it's ever stopped me. I mean, I don't really worry about markets, but at the same time, I feel uncomfortable in the world of children's books as it is at the moment. And also, to be honest with you, I've had my run. I've done something like 35 children's books, and I've sold a lot of copies. In a way, I think it's time to step aside and let somebody else take over now, the next young writer to come up and do something exciting and new. I know that when I was 21, I used to get very fed up with just Roald Dahl. All anybody talked about was Roald Dahl. And I don't want some kid who's a young writer thinking, why doesn't Anthony Horowitz just drop dead? Let me, So that's but listen, I am going to do another kids' book, that is for sure, because my publishers of Walker Books want me to. And there is also a responsibility to people like them who want me to do some more stuff. I might even think about doing another Alex Rider book, but at the moment there are no plans.
You're right. I mean, you obviously write lots and lots. Do you have more than one project on the go at once?
I normally have about 3 or 4. I love writing, and one of the problems I have is saying no. And there are so many interesting things to write at the moment out there. So, for example, as I sit here today, I've got a feature film with Disney, and I said yes to that one because working for the Americans is so interesting. I mean, it always ends in tears. I know I'll get fired, they won't make my film, but it's nice when it happens. And then there's a Bond novel, which I just read a little extract of. I'm working on a new television series with my wife, Jill Green, who's the producer of Foyle's War, who's also here tonight, incidentally, and we now have a new series to work on for next year. And there's something else I'm doing as well. A 4th thing, I'll play. I'm writing a play. So that it may seem a lot, but it's not really, because when you're a writer, it's a very, very long day. I spend 10, 12 hours by myself in my flat in Clerkenwell, and people in offices have meetings, they talk about what they saw on television, they have coffee, they get to the office and they leave the office, they go out for lunch and have sandwiches. But 7 hours in an office probably boils down to 2 or 3 hours working, whereas for me, 12 hours is 12 hours. I'm by myself. I'll be honest, I get lonely. I'm the only person I know who, when I get one of those cold callers, like, are you double glazing? I say, oh yes, tell me more about it. Let's have a conversation, But that's how I get so much done, is by having so much time.
So in one day you might work on different...
No, I only work on one thing in one day, but I work very intensively. So today, for example, was a Bond day. I finished a chapter just before I left the house to come here, and that's the day's work.
My time's up, I think. It's over to you. Have we got any questions? I'm sure we've got a whole queue of questions.
Not to take you into politics too much, but 2 weeks ago you were on Question Time. And they turned to you and said, you said, I'm not enjoying this much. Mm-hmm. And you pointed out that it went from one political party to the other. I just wondered what it felt like being in the midst of modern politics and what your views were when you said that.
Well, when I say I'm not enjoying it very much on Question Time 2 weeks ago, I was understating it. I was having a horrible time. I hated every minute of it. And I also asked myself why I was there. Why do people like me? I'm not a clever person, I'm not a politician, I'm not sort of somebody who is that deep thinking. Why am I on television trying to talk politics to these people? So I just sat there thinking to myself, the political system in this country is broken, and here is as good a demonstration of it as you'll see. And what I think is interesting right now, in the world that we are, with an election 6 months away, is that the mavericks, Russell Brand, Boris Johnson, George Galloway, and of course Nigel Farage, who are all in their own way as potent as each other, are coming through on the back of a political system that isn't working. And that, I think, is really worrying, because whatever you may think of these people, I'm naming no names, I'm sure each has their supporters in the room, I would have said at least 2 of them are quite dangerous. And yet there they are getting airtime, etc. And so maybe that's why I should be on Question Time, is to sort of just be a voice of vaguely of reason. I don't know. But now, don't know if you heard that on this table, apart from myself, who is my favourite author. I am not my own favourite children's author by a long way. I've been very lucky. I mean, children's books, when I started writing them, was a curse. I mean, nobody wanted to know. If you went into Waterstones to buy a children's book, I swear to you, you went in through the front door, through fiction, through cookery, through business studies, up a stairway, down an alleyway, into the basement, and there, in the darkness, was children's books, and it was completely, nobody was interested in it. So the short answer question is who's my favourite is J.K. Rowling, because she changed everything. Just the success of Harry Potter created a new wave of writers, on which the writers I've already mentioned, Philip Pullman and Michael Morpurgo and others, we all rode. I would not have had my career without her. I think if you want me to answer the question of who is the most interesting children's author alive at the moment, it's Patrick Ness. I don't know if you've read A Monster Calls, but it's a fantastic book, whether you're an adult or a child. And I think instead the best test of a book for young people is that it doesn't put off older people who read it to them. My books were always designed to be read by adults with their children. A Monster Calls is a superb piece. It's won many, many awards. And The Night of Never Letting Go is also a sensational book, except he made a huge mistake around about chapter 30. I won't tell you what it is, but I didn't enjoy the rest of it. But after that, he's a consistently interesting writer.
You mentioned Philip Pullman several times, and I particularly like the Dark Materials, which seem to introduce, it has several levels, doesn't it, children and adults. Do you try to introduce a morality in your books, or aim at different levels, child?
Did you all hear that side of the room? You heard the question? Talking about morality in children's books and whether I introduce it. We're talking about Philip Pullman, but his books work on so many different levels, and the question is, do I introduce morality? It's a very, very interesting question, and I'll tell you what my feeling is. I think that if you write books for young people, there aren't many differences between writing for young people and writing for old people. I can be rude if I want to be, I can put offensive material, and I can be very violent. But I do think that there are certain responsibilities that a writer for young people has. One of them is to produce a happy ending. Why is it that young people who have their whole life in front of them and who are so optimistic and hopeful and forward-looking should be told you're doomed, it's going to be awful, you're going to be miserable, your parents are going to get divorced, you might as well give up now. So every single one of my kids' books has had a happy ending, pretty much. Oblivion is the only one where it's a little bit muted happy ending, and that's why it took me 7 years to write it, because I knew I couldn't escape it. Morality. Yes, I think I do try and impose a certain morality in my books. Again, for sort of the same reason, which is that my job is not to be didactic, it's not to be political, it's not to be right thinking, but at the same time, these are children, and therefore I have an innate responsibility to be moralistic. I'll give you a good example of it. In one of the Alex Rider books, it's Eagle Strike. Alex has to get into a building, a concert or something, and he pickpockets somebody, and I explain how he's learned from his uncle the art of pickpocketing, and he does it in a rather clever way. So he steals somebody's ticket and goes in. But I do at least stop for a sentence to say Alex is concerned about what he's done, should he have done it. So there is sort of it's not a particularly moral moment, but there is still a nudge towards it. That's why very few, or only the bad guys in my book smoke. It's a simple thing as that. One of my villains is called Julia Rothman, which seems like a good name for somebody who wants to kill people. And so, that little tiny little thing towards it. But at the same time, I think that, Dahl became huge and successful because of his anarchy, because he was the first person to recognize children do not want everything black and white and this is good, this is bad. You can be mischievous, which is why whenever children ask me for advice about writing, I give them various pieces of advice, but the one that they always like is, I say you've got to have experience, go out and have fun, have adventures, do something illegal, don't get caught. Which I think is good advice for young people, really, because though it's entirely moralistic, is nonetheless, there is some kind of life lesson in it. So.
Bad sex awards have just been announced. We talked about morality earlier. Have you been influenced in your later Bond novels by the
sex?
Popularity of 50 Shades of Grey?
Have you read it? Sex and bad sex. Well, it is true that for Bond I have to write my very first sex scenes, which is sort of quite worrying. Although that said, again, emulating Ian Fleming, he didn't actually write very much. He sort of cuts, fortunately, quite early, so one doesn't get into sort of, the heavy biological stuff, which I sort of, not too keen on. I am going to tread very, very carefully. In fact, I'll finish by describing an absolutely true thing that happened in the Bond novel. The first people to read were my family, and if they squirm, then I know I'm in trouble. But I remember writing one of the Alex Rider books. Again, you're talking about morality over there. I decided that in just one Alex Rider book, I would look at what it's like to be a sort of a prepubescent 14-year-old boy and having your first kiss from a beautiful girl. And he had a girlfriend called Sabina Pleasure, which is a terrible sort of Bond thing. Bond has Pussy Galore or Tiffany Gates. I had Sabina Pleasure. I said, Sabina Pleasure meeting you. And innocent. And I thought they parted company at the end of Eagle Strike was the last thing. And at the end of that chapter, I wrote this kiss, and it was a one-paragraph kiss of everything happening that would happen to a 14-year-old boy getting a passionate kiss from his girlfriend for the first time. And my younger son came into my office at that point and looked over my shoulder and looked at the screen. He was about 14 himself. And I'll just never forget what he said. He said, "Dad, if you publish that, I'm leaving home." I think bearing that in mind with the Bond novel, I'm going to be very, very careful. Thank you very much.